Let's talk about the Nutilities Create Pivot Table utility. The default keys for this are Control, Shift, Alt, and P. You can find this on the Utilities menu under Author's Favorite, Create Pivot Table, and it's the utility at the top. I put together a sample set of data to use for this demonstration. And what this utility does is it takes a data set and creates a pivot table on the fly for you. And it's a pivot table that I've custom set up to be useful for analysis. So to put it another way, typically when you created a pivot table with the built-in Excel functionality, it spits out a default pivot table that's very cumbersome and not easy to use for analysis. So I put together this utility that'll spit one out that's already pre-set up for you. So let's take a look at how it works. I'm just going to highlight the data that I want in my pivot table. With my left hand, I'm going to hold down Control, Shift, Alt, and then hit P with my right hand. Out spits a pivot table on a separate tab. I'm going to go ahead and bring in a few fields to demonstrate how this pivot table works. And I'm just going to quickly change the number formats on these using a different utility because I can't stand it when there's lots of decimals. And we're ready to go. So I just created this pivot table on the fly using Nutilities. And you can see it's a very simple looking table. It's in black and white, it's in tabular format, it has repeated values turned on, and it has no subtotals. To show you what I mean, let's take a look at the same data set, but build a pivot table using the internal functionality of Excel. So I'd highlight the data set, go to Insert, Pivot Table. I've already highlighted the range of the data. I'm going to say I want to put it on an existing sheet, and I'll just stick it on the same sheet that I have the other table on just so you can see them side by side. I'll go ahead and bring in the same fields that I brought in on the Nutilities pivot table. Quickly change the number formats the same way. And you can see that my pivot table through Nutilities is much easier to read than the one that came out through Excel. Also, if you're doing any sort of analysis that requires you to put formulas that reference your pivot table, it's hard to work with a pivot table that's in this compact format. You can see that it's got everything in one column, whereas mine has it split out into 3 columns. If you were to try to create my pivot table by using the internal functionality, you would have to create the table like we just did, then you'd go to Design, and you'd start plugging away at it. The first thing you'd do is make it black and white if you don't like colors. So I'm just going to click the scroll to the top, turn it black and white. Then the next thing you'd need to do is make it tabular. Now it's tabular. And I think in this view you can see why having subtotals turned off is nice. Right now subtotals are turned on it, and you can see you got all these different total lines that are just making this thing really confusing to read. And to get those off, we'd go to Design, Report Layout, no, Subtotals, do not show subtotals. And then the only difference is mine has repeat values turned on, so turn those on. And those are all the steps it would take to make the internal one look like the one that's created by Nutilities by default. Another benefit of Nutilities is that its data range uses a dynamic named range. What that means is anytime you refresh the pivot table, it'll automatically expand to grab all the data that you have. And I guess it's hard to explain that, so let me just show you. Let's say that if I went back to my original data set and I pasted in new data, and I'm just going to call everything test just to illustrate the point. And just throw in, what is that, 1 million? If I come back to our pivots, the Nutilities pivot, if I hit refresh, you'll see that it automatically grabbed that new row of data. If I go to the Excel built-in pivot and hit refresh, you'll see that it didn't grab any data. And the reason is on the Excel data, or on the Excel pivot, its data set is hard-coded to the original range that I built it on. And so in order to get this extra row, I'd actually have to highlight it and put it into this data set. And now it's showing up. Whereas on the Nutilities pivot, if I go to its data set, you'll see that it has a named range of nutpiv1, and it's already highlighting that extra row of data. If you wanted to see what that named range looks like, you could always go to Formulas, Name Manager. You'll find nutpiv1 in there, and you'll see the dynamic named range formula that's used to calculate the range that it's feeding off of. Something to watch out for is by using a dynamic named range, it very much does not like it if you put a blank row in your data set. So for example, if I'd put the new row of data one row down and leaving a blank row in between, just like so, if I go back and refresh my pivot table, you'll see that Nutilities, the dynamic named range, is not capturing it anymore. It's in fact capturing a blank row. So let's just take a look at the data set and see what happened. You'll see that it knew that one row was added, but it didn't realize that it's added 2 rows down. It only counts down 1 row, so it's going to miss the new row. So in order to avoid this, just don't leave blank rows inside your data set. And you're welcome to use this Nutility over and over again in the same workbook. If I wanted to create another pivot table in the same workbook, I could just highlight whatever data source I have. I'm just going to do it on the same one here. Hit Control-Shift-P, and boom, it spits out a new pivot on a new table. And this one will have a named range associated with it, except its name range will be nutpiv2. And if you were to use it again on a different data set, or even the same data set, you'd end up with a nutpiv3 and so on, and it'd just keep counting up. One more feature to note is that on my pivot table, you'll notice that it's missing these pluses, or these minus and plus signs, which allow you to collapse and expand. So on theirs, they have this plus and minus side. I've taken those off because it just gets in the way, and you can still do the expand and collapse by just double clicking. So I just double clicked on that cell. By double clicking, it will collapse, and then if I double click again, it will expand, which has the same functionality of hitting the minus and the plus. And you can always right click and hit expand entire field or whatever, just like you would normally.